Hi guys, friend of the Sunday Roast and head of Save British Farming Liz Webster appeared on GB News where she tried to educate the 19th century gentleman Jacob Rees-Mogg on Brexit. It must be remembered that Mogg is incapable of either admitting that he was wrong or that he lied about leaving the European Union, as this would involve losing face. The farmer explained really well the problems not just facing her sector but Britain as a whole, as the UK is no longer a member of the European Union and that GB is no longer a member of the single market. Mogg didn't push back with facts, he just tried to interrupt a lot, but Liz was able to hold her own. Have a listen.
Thank you for coming in. I have a sneaking suspicion it may just be possible we could agree on this, that the EU is a heavily regulated organisation, so why should we suddenly think cheese from France is dangerous? It may not be as nice as cheddar from Somerset, but it's not actively dangerous.
Well, it's not as simple as that, and it never is. The reality is that anything coming via Rotterdam is able to get in without any checks. And obviously, we're being penalised with checks. The answer is to agree to a veterinary agreement, dynamically align with EU regs, and we get rid of the barriers or most of them.
But what you want to do is rejoin the EU. That's basically always been your position, hasn't it?
Because for food and farming,
let's have the wonderful picture from your family farm that came up when there was a campaign for the second referendum. Put it on the screen now. There we go.
Yes.
That was your family farm. So we know you want us to be effectively part of the EU.
Yeah.
And if we align to their veterinary rules, we might as well not have left. That would be completely pointless. And we wouldn't get the advantage of cheaper food for our consumers.
Now, when Jacob Rees-Mogg talks about cheaper food, he's talking about low quality food, lower standards, like with the Australian and New Zealand trade deals. Jacob Rees-Mogg is not talking about high quality food. He's talking about low quality food, which is cheaper. Now, this, of course, if you bring in cheaper quality, lower quality food, you're going to decimate British farming. Jacob Rees-Mogg will not admit that, but that's the reality. And Liz Webster and other farmers have pointed this out. If you're going to flood the UK market, or I should say the Great Britain market, because the UK, including Northern Ireland is a separate case. But if you talk about Britain, you're going to flood the British market with low quality produce, which is of course going to undercut British farming.
The thing is, Jacob, that we've left and we failed to remain. And I accept that we have Brexit. I'm not a denier of reality. But now things have moved on and we're experiencing Brexit. And many of my friends in farming who did believe in Brexit have come around to realise that these trade deals are undercutting us with substandard foods and also the complete unfairness.
Hold on, the EU food isn't substandard. No, the EU food isn't substandard. That's a different argument.
I just explained anything coming via Rotterdam, it's a huge port, coming here, including illegal food.
If it goes into Rotterdam, it has to meet EU regulations.
So, Jacob says here, if it comes via Rotterdam, it has to be EU regulations. No, it doesn't. Because if the final destination is not the EU single market, then it doesn't have to meet EU standards. Just think about it for a moment. Why would the port of Rotterdam be carrying out checks on behalf of Britain? Britain is no longer a member of the single market. So why would it carry out those checks? Stuff will come via Rotterdam, but if the final destination is not the EU, then whoever it's going to will have to carry out those checks. Now, it must be remembered that when the UK was a member of the European Union, it didn't have to take the whole burden of checks because a lot of the checks were done in other parts of the EU. There were checks carried out, but just goods coming directly from outside the single market. Now that the UK is on its own, it has to carry out all the checks. All the checks for all the goods coming in. Now, Michael Gove, a friend of Jacob Rees-Mogg, said, don't worry, what we're going to do is we're going to hire 50,000 customs officers. We're going to have all these officers who are going to carry out these checks. Have these officers been hired? Of course not. So we have another Brexit lie to put on the pile. If you don't have enough officers, then obviously you can't carry out as many checks as necessary. So you're going to have to wave stuff through because you don't have the time, you don't have the resources. And of course, stuff is going to come through that's not being checked, and this is going to be extremely risky for British farming.
That's why foodborne illness is going through the roof.
If it's gone into Rotterdam, it's met EU regulations. It can't go without meeting them.
No.
This shows a complete lack of understanding. Now, I don't know if he doesn't know this or he's lying. Either way, this is very serious because you have a Tory MP, former business secretary, who's saying, well, if stuff goes in through Rotterdam, then obviously it meets EU standards. No, it does not, Jacob, because if its final destination is not the EU single market, then it doesn't have to meet EU standards.
Oh, because we've left all of
No. But
Jacob, you can't just argue over me. You need to let me speak.
I am letting you speak. But
if you want me to be on the show, you need to let me speak.
Things that are transported through the EU have to meet EU regulations.
No, they don't, because we've left all of the organisations, and we didn't have to. That was a decision by your friend, Boris Johnson. We didn't have to leave all of the certain bodies which ensured that we were within the security system of the food system. But we've left all of that. So a friend of mine who imports foods imported some starch from India, which came via Rotterdam, and it was absolutely full of bugs because nobody's checking anything that comes in here, including hordes of illegal meat, which is full of bugs, not refrigerated, and an absolute risk to human health.
But this is products being imported illegally.
Sorry, what? How did you come to that determination that it was imported illegally? Where did that come from? He has no evidence to back up that claim that this was something imported illegally. It's the fact that the UK is no longer a member of the European Union and the single market. It means that the EU is not going to carry out checks on behalf of Britain. If something is arriving from India and the destination is outside the single market, then the checks that normally take place in Rotterdam will not be carried out. Because why, once again, would the EU spend money to protect the UK single market?
As you know perfectly well, goods that come from the EU into the UK through a legal channel
a lot of them are coming
are
from
now
Eastern
going to
Europe.
be checked.
This is from the EU. But once again, if it's not from the EU, it's not going to be checked.
If goods are coming in illegally, that's an entirely different matter. As you know, that they're evading checks anyway, so these checks don't stop illegal goods. They're nothing to do with illegal goods.
We didn't have anywhere near this level of illegal food coming in when we were within the body of the European Union.
Yes, we did. We had horse meat coming from Romania. You must remember.
Oh, my goodness. And horse meat was checked. That's why it became a story. How many things are coming into Britain that are not being checked, that are not being reported? Obviously, they're not being reported because they're not being checked.
You, Jacob, we just don't like eating horse in this country. And it was also the corporations, but also nowadays, you wouldn't even know about the horse meat because nobody's checking anything.
You would, because
every label is labels now for minced beef, which they packaged in the UK, and it doesn't even give you the origin of where that meat has come from.
Goods that come in from the EU are tracked right back to the farm, as you know.
If it's produced in the EU for sale in the EU, it's tracked and checked. But if it's not destined for the EU, why is he so stupid he doesn't understand this? Once again, I have to ask this question. Is he lying or is he ignorant?
What I'm saying is that we should trust safe countries, and this includes New Zealand, but it also includes the EU because their products are safe. You're trying to argue about something completely different, which is illegal goods coming into this country.
We're not talking about illegal goods. Jacob Rees-Mogg said back in 2022, I think it was, when he was business secretary, he said, we're not actually going to carry out these checks because it'd be too expensive. Just let that marinade in your mind for a moment. He said, let's not carry out these checks because it would be too expensive. And now he's saying, well, you're talking about illegal goods. So how are you supposed to determine which is legal and which is illegal? Because you have to carry out checks. You have to carry out the checks on the goods coming in from the EU, and you have to carry out checks on goods coming from outside the EU. Because it's possible that someone in the EU could decide, well, actually, we have all this produce that we can't sell in the EU because it doesn't meet the standard. What we could do is we could sell it to the UK because their standard is lower, it seems, and they're not carrying out checks.
You try and check in a completely different way. Smuggled meat and goods from India that are pretending to be from the EU won't be affected by this change in the regulation.
You have to check them. How can you determine if something is illegal or not? This is a lot of repeating, I'm sorry, but Is he really this stupid?
Millions of pounds on white elephant checking facilities, which are not going to be used. First of all, we've got a labour shortage.
They should be scrapped, those checking facilities.
I've just recently come back from Africa, where I went from Botswana through to Zambia, and we had to go through significant checks because of the agricultural risks of spreading disease. We've already got blue tongue in Britain now since Brexit, and it is because we've got this...
Blue tongue has no relationship with Brexit.
Because we've not got any checks and we've left all of the food security mechanisms within the European Union.
This simply isn't true. We have kept checks on goods coming in from countries outside the EU, and illegal goods coming in has always been a problem. There's always been an issue with smuggling, and you're...
Oh my God, I have to give up at this stage, because he seems to think, well, if something is coming from the EU, he doesn't understand the difference between from and via. But he seems to think that, well, if it's coming from the EU, we don't have to check it because the EU have high standards. But once again, you don't know what's coming via the EU and from the EU if you're not carrying out checks. And you also don't know what's in the country at the moment because you haven't carried out the checks. What Liz is trying to tell him, I think, is we need to carry out checks. We need to protect British farming. You just want to get rid of all these checks because you don't care. And you also just want to decimate British farming because you want to import a load of low quality things. Jacob Rees-Mogg is still on TV. Jacob Rees-Mogg is still an MP. I hope what's going to happen at the next election is he's going to lose his seat and he's going to be restricted in the oxygen that he's been provided to sell these ideas, because hopefully he'll lose his job at GB News as well, because he'll no longer be an MP, he'll be no longer valuable. But he's able to every night after night talk about how great Brexit is and how there's nothing to worry about because the EU carry out these checks and we don't have to. Not understanding or pretending not to understand the reality of the situation. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.